Imagine an empire everyone believed was already dead. Barbarians smashed its cities, plagues burned through its streets, civil wars tore it apart. Rome fell. The world changed. And yet, somehow, one half of that empire refused to vanish. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled into dust, another Rome rose on the shores of the Bosporus, richer, smarter, more resilient, and far more dangerous. This is the story of the empire that learned to bend instead of break, the empire that traded gold instead of spilling blood, that hired enemies, stole secrets, rewrote laws, preserved knowledge, and quietly shaped the future of Europe, the Middle East, and Christianity itself. This is Eastern Rome, the empire that would not die. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? When most people hear the fall of Rome, they imagine flames, chaos, barbarians crashing through gates, and history books slamming shut forever. In 476 AD, a young boy emperor was dethroned in the West, and the Western Roman Empire disappeared from the map. But that ending, it was only half the story. Because Rome wasn't just a city. Rome was an idea, a system, a civilization that had already shifted its beating heart hundreds of miles east to a glittering city called Constantinople. Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 AD, Constantinople wasn't built to be merely another capital. It was designed as a fortress, a marketplace, and a holy city all in one. Surrounded by sea on three sides, protected by massive triple walls, and standing at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, it controlled the lifelines of trade. Gold flowed in, knowledge flowed in, power flowed in. So when the Western Empire collapsed, emperors in Constantinople didn't mourn. They declared, "We are still Rome. We are the Roman Empire." And they were right. They still had Roman law, Roman administration, Roman armies, Roman culture, and just evolving, adapting, transforming. But survival came at a cost. Eastern Rome was constantly surrounded by threats. Persians in the east, Germanic tribes in the Balkans, desert raiders, rival warlords, and, eventually, new rising powers that would test its limits. Unlike the West, which tried to fight everyone and lost everything, Eastern Rome learned an entirely different survival strategy. It outthought enemies instead of outfighting them. Gold became their greatest weapon. Bribes, alliances, marriage deals, hired mercenaries, all used with cold intelligence. Diplomats traveled with gifts, spies, maps, and promises. Enemies were turned against each other. Where the West saw honor in battle, the East saw victory in survival. At the same time, emperors invested heavily in learning and administration. Libraries preserved Greek philosophy, Roman science, medical texts, histories, and theology. Laws were reorganized into the famous Justinian Code, which would later form the basis for legal systems across Europe. Eastern Rome wasn't perfect. It was political, ruthless, often brutal. But it was organized, and organization meant life. Constantinople itself symbolized that strength. Its harbor, the Golden Horn, was protected with a giant iron chain stretched across the water. Its walls, the legendary Theodosian walls, stood like a mountain of stone. Siege after siege battered them, armies broke like waves. While kingdoms in the West rose and vanished, Eastern Rome endured. And the world kept asking how? Was it luck, strategy, faith, geography? The truth is more fascinating, a unique combination of leadership, intelligence, adaptability, and timing. Over the next chapters, we'll uncover how this empire fought off enemies, reinvented itself again and again, and survived disasters that should have destroyed it. Because this wasn't a static empire frozen in marble. It was alive, changing, learning, becoming something new, while still calling itself Rome. If Eastern Rome had a moment when everything seemed possible and everything nearly collapsed, it happened under one man, Emperor Justinian. When Justinian rose to power in the 6th century, he carried a dangerous dream to reunite the entire Roman world. For Justinian, the Western fall wasn't destiny. It was a mistake that needed to be corrected. He wanted the Mediterranean to once again become a Roman lake ruled from Constantinople. And he had the tools: a brilliant legal mind, a relentless work ethic, and a fearless, sometimes terrifying, determination. But Justinian didn't rule alone. Standing beside him was one of the most extraordinary women in history, Empress Theodora. Once a poor actress, mocked and underestimated, she rose to become his equal. Powerful, intelligent, politically ruthless, she refused to let anyone treat her as less than an emperor. Together, they reformed everything. They rewrote laws to control corruption. They defended the poor more than previous rulers had dared. They reshaped the church's power, tightened administration, standardized taxes. And then Justinian turned outward. He unleashed his generals. Most legendary among them was Belisarius, a commander who fought with strategy instead of arrogance. With small, disciplined armies, he defeated enemies many times his size. North Africa fell, Italy fell. Parts of Spain returned to the empire. For a brief, blinding moment, it looked as though Rome had risen again. But the universe was about to strike back. First came rebellion itself, the Nika revolts. Racing factions, angry mobs, corrupt officials, and political enemies united against Justinian. For days, Constantinople burned. Palaces, markets, entire neighborhoods collapsed in flames. Justinian was ready to flee, but Theodora refused. She looked at the emperor and said words that froze history. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. Better to die a ruler than live in fear." Her iron will kept Justinian on the throne, and with brutal force, the revolt was crushed. Tens of thousands died, and the city was drenched in silence. Out of that silence, Justinian built something eternal. Hagia Sophia. A cathedral of impossible beauty, crowned with a floating dome of light. It wasn't just a building, it was a declaration. Rome still lives. But then came the enemy no wall could stop. Ships carried grain to Constantinople and rats carried death. The plague of Justinian ripped through the empire like fire. Streets filled with bodies. Trade collapsed. Armies weakened. The economy shattered. Justinian himself fell ill and nearly died. The empire that had just stretched across the Mediterranean suddenly seemed fragile, exhausted, bleeding. Borders wavered. Enemies pressed from every direction. Persians attacked in the east. Lombards invaded Italy. Slavs and Avars poured into the Balkans. All those victories, all those dreams of a reunited Rome, they began slipping away. Yet, and this is what makes Eastern Rome astonishing, it didn't break. Weakened, yes, wounded deeply, but not destroyed, because Eastern Rome didn't rely only on conquest. Its true strength was flexibility. Officials reorganized taxes. Generals learned to fight smaller, faster wars. Cities had supply storage and layered defenses. And most importantly, the government, brutal but efficient, never lost control completely. Where another civilization might have shattered under revolt, plague, and invasion, Eastern Rome tightened its grip and endured. By the time Justinian died, the empire was poorer, scarred, and smaller than his dream, but it was still alive. And soon, an entirely new kind of storm was coming, one that would change the world forever, from Arabia to the Mediterranean. A storm called Islam, and it would test Eastern Rome more fiercely than anything before. When Justinian died, Eastern Rome was tired, weakened by wars, rebellions, and plague. But it still controlled powerful cities, deep trade routes, and the most fortified capital on earth. Nobody expected what would happen next. From the deserts of Arabia, a new power emerged, united by faith, discipline, and astonishing speed. Within decades, the armies of the early Islamic caliphates broke through borders that had stood for centuries, and they moved like lightning. Syria fell, Jerusalem fell. Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, was lost. For Eastern Rome, this wasn't just military defeat, it was psychological shock. Ancient lands that had been Roman for hundreds of years vanished almost overnight. Taxes disappeared, trade shifted. The empire shrank into a tight ring of territory around Anatolia, Greece, and the Balkans. Many historians expected the empire to collapse right then, but instead, it transformed. For centuries, Rome's strength had depended on owning the Mediterranean coastlines. Now those belonged largely to rising Islamic states. So Eastern Rome did something extraordinary. It let go of the dream of ruling everything. Instead, it focused on survival. Borders became deeper, more layered. Military provinces, called themes, were organized so local soldiers lived on the land they defended. Armies could respond faster. Generals had more control. It was no longer about glory, it was about endurance. At the same time, Constantinople became more than a capital. It became the shield of Europe. Behind its gigantic walls, emperors built stockpiles, reorganized administration, and turned the city into an almost invincible stronghold guarding the entrance to the continent. But even walls have limits. Twice the empire faced annihilation at the gates. Arab fleets and armies surrounded Constantinople, determined to end Rome forever. The city trembled, supplies dwindled. Every prayer echoed with fear. And then the defenders unleashed one of history's most mysterious weapons, Greek fire. A burning liquid that clung to water and devoured ships alive. Launched from tubes and siphons, it turned the sea into an inferno. Enemy fleets panicked, armies retreated. Constantinople survived. But Greek fire wasn't just technology. It symbolized something deeper. Eastern Rome fought not with brute force, but with innovation, science, and strategy. Each time death surrounded it, the empire shifted, adapted, found something new. Faith, culture, and identity. Another transformation unfolded inside the empire. Greek gradually replaced Latin in administration. Byzantine art flourished in gold mosaics and icons. The church gained immense influence, shaping politics and identity. The empire was still Roman, but also increasingly Greek, Christian, and Eastern. This changing identity gave the people a reason to endure. They believed they were defending not just land, but civilization, faith, and history itself. And yet it was never peaceful. Assassinations, palace coup, scheming eunuchs, corrupt generals, Eastern Rome was filled with drama. Emperors lost thrones overnight. Some were blinded, exiled, or executed. But strangely, the system survived even when rulers didn't. Administration was strong enough to outlive bad leaders. Documents kept moving, taxes kept flowing. Soldiers still showed up. The machine of empire, cold, relentless, marched on. By this point in history, any normal state would have shattered. Eastern Rome survived because it mastered three crucial arts: adaptation, changing its identity, laws, and military structure; intelligence, using diplomacy, gold, marriage, and spies more than swords; resilience, willingly shrinking to survive rather than dying in pride. Instead of clinging to the past, it kept reinventing itself. But new nightmares were still ahead. Vikings would come down the rivers. Bulgarian warlords would carve kingdoms from its borders. And far in the future, a new empire would rise in the east that would one day threaten Constantinople itself: the Ottomans. For now, though, Eastern Rome still stood, scarred, smaller, transformed, but alive. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Eastern Rome was older, wiser, and surrounded by danger. But danger was nothing new. The empire had survived Persians, Arabs, plagues, rebellions, and near starvation. Now, entirely new players entered the stage. From the frozen north sailed warriors hungry for gold and glory, the Varangians, ancestors of the Vikings and Rus. Instead of attacking Constantinople, many of them joined it. They became the elite Varangian Guard, personal bodyguards of the emperor. Towering men with massive axes, sworn to loyalty, guarding the palace from scheming nobles. It was another brilliant move. Rather than fighting these fierce warriors, the empire hired them. Eastern Rome turned enemies into weapons. The 10th and early 11th centuries saw powerful emperors like Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer. Through brutal discipline and relentless campaigns, he crushed rivals and restored imperial strength. Trade expanded, cities flourished, wealth returned. But hidden beneath this success were cracks. Powerful nobles grew richer than the state. Peasants lost land. The army slowly depended more on mercenaries than citizen soldiers. The machine still worked, but its gears were grinding. And then came one of the greatest turning points in medieval history. The Christian world split in two: Roman Catholic West and Eastern Orthodox East. This wasn't just a religious argument. It shattered alliances, trust, and unity. When trouble came, the West would no longer see Eastern Rome as the same civilization. That trouble arrived with terrifying speed. In 1071, the empire faced the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert. Through betrayal, confusion, and bad leadership, Eastern Rome suffered catastrophic defeat. Anatolia, its heartland, its farmland, its manpower, began slipping away. For the first time, the empire's foundations truly shook. Desperate, emperors asked the West for help. They expected soldiers. What came was chaos. When the First Crusade marched east, it didn't see Constantinople as Rome, but as an obstacle, a rival, sometimes even an enemy. Crusader armies were unpredictable, proud, and often violent. They helped defeat some enemies, yes, but they also carved their own kingdoms, ignoring imperial authority. Still, Eastern Rome survived, reduced, humiliated, nervous, but alive. Until one day, the West did what the East feared most. Instead of marching to fight Muslims, the Fourth Crusade turned its armies on Constantinople itself. What followed was horror. The greatest Christian city in the world was looted by Christian knights. Libraries burned, relics stolen, palaces ransacked, thousands killed. The empire was torn apart, divided into fragments ruled by foreign lords. If there was a moment Eastern Rome truly should have died, this was it. But in one final act of defiance, exiled Romans regrouped in the city of Nicaea. They rebuilt armies, retook lands, and, against all odds, reclaimed Constantinople in 1261. The empire returned, but it was now a ghost of its former self. Weakened, poor, surrounded, and in the east a new power was rising. Disciplined, ambitious, relentless. The Ottomans. They would bring the final test. But even then, Eastern Rome would hold on longer than anyone expected, still refusing to die. By the 14th century, the empire that once ruled the Mediterranean was reduced to a shadow. A few scattered cities, a thin ribbon of land, a capital that had once been the richest city in the world, now cracked, quiet, and nearly empty. But Constantinople still stood. Its walls, scarred, repaired, rebuilt again and again, rose like bones of an ancient titan. And inside those walls lived a people who refused to surrender their identity. They still called themselves Romaioi, Romans. Even when the treasury was almost empty, even when fields were lost, even when enemies pressed from every direction, they believed Rome was not just territory, it was continuity. Memory civilization itself. Across the straits, a new empire grew powerful, the Ottomans. They were organized, disciplined, and led by visionary rulers. Unlike many enemies Rome had faced, the Ottomans were patient. They didn't rush, they surrounded, absorbed, waited. Bit by bit, they took the remaining lands of Eastern Rome. Yet Constantinople still refused to fall. Inside its walls, emperors negotiated, begged for alliances, tried to reform government, and prayed. Scholars preserved manuscripts. Priests kept the rituals alive. Citizens looked at the aging walls and whispered hope. And then came a young sultan, Mehmed II. Brilliant. Determined, obsessed. He didn't just want to conquer Constantinople. He wanted to end the Roman story. Ottoman cannons thundered, ships blockaded the sea, soldiers built bridges and dragged vessels across land. For weeks, the city shook. Inside, Emperor Constantine V led his people personally on the walls, a final symbol of Roman defiance. There were no armies left to send, no allies coming to save them, just courage, faith, and the memory of a world that had once been theirs. Then on a May morning, the walls finally broke. The last Roman emperor disappeared in the chaos. Legend says he fought until his sword shattered. The city was taken, bells fell silent. After more than 100 years, Eastern Rome was gone. Or was it? Empires fall on maps. But civilizations live inside memory, law, language, culture, and ideas. Eastern Rome passed its legacy forward in ways few people realize. It preserved ancient Greek philosophy and science, which later fueled the Renaissance. It protected Europe's eastern frontier for centuries, absorbing invasions others could not. Its legal system shaped modern law. Its art, theology, and scholarship reshaped Christianity. Even the Ottomans who conquered Constantinople respected that legacy. They kept the city as their capital and inherited its strategic brilliance. And when people today speak of diplomacy, bureaucracy, imperial administration, fortified cities, written law, they are touching echoes of Eastern Rome. So when historians ask, why didn't Eastern Rome die? The real answer is this: it did and it didn't. The empire eventually fell. But the ideas that sustained it simply changed clothes, traveling onward through new cultures, governments, and nations. Eastern Rome survived because it understood something most empires never do. To live long, you must be willing to change. Not stubborn pride, not blind expansion, but adaptation, intelligence, and resilience. From Constantine to Justinian, from plagues to crusades, from Greek fire to cannon fire, it endured longer than any empire of the ancient world. And even when its walls finally crumbled, its spirit walked quietly into the future. Because some empires rule with armies, and some rule with time.